There's a moment in every great discovery when the world splits into two halves, the before and the after. The moment someone lifts a rock and finds something beneath it that rewrites everything. The moment a wall comes down and the darkness behind it breathes for the first time in centuries, maybe millennia. That moment happened in a farmhouse basement in Saskatchewan, and what it revealed wasn't just old. It wasn't just strange. It was the kind of thing that makes historians go quiet and archaeologists reach for their phones at 2 a.m. Because what this family found behind that wall was older than Canada, older than European contact, older than most people's understanding of who was living on this land and when. Tonight, we are going inside that basement. We are going back through time. Way back. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. In the spring of 2019, a family in rural Saskatchewan decided it was finally time to renovate their basement. The house itself had been standing since the early 1900s, one of those wide, square prairie farmhouses that you see dotted across the Canadian plains, like survivors of a previous era built when the land was new to settlers and the winters were the only real authority. The family had lived there for years. They knew every creak of the floorboards above. They knew which door swelled in summer and which window let in a cold draft, no matter how much weather stripping you used. But the basement, that was different. The basement they had mostly avoided. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't flooded or crumbling. It was just old, the kind of old that settles over a space in layers you can actually feel when you step off the bottom stair. The kind of old that makes the air feel thicker, slower, like it has somewhere else to be. The concrete block walls were original. The floor was original. Even the single bare bulb that dangled from the ceiling by a knot of old cloth-wrapped wire felt like something out of a photograph from a different century. Which, technically, it was. The renovation plan was simple. They were going to open the space up, pull out the old coal storage room along the north wall, frame it out, add some drywall, turn the whole basement into something usable. A playroom maybe, or a laundry area that didn't feel like a place where bad things happened. The coal storage room had a wooden door that hadn't opened, easily in decades, sealed by time and swollen wood and the kind of stubbornness that old houses develop when nobody pays attention to them for long enough. When they finally forced that door open, they found the coal room empty, which wasn't surprising. Nobody had burned coal in decades, but the back wall of the coal room gave them pause. It was different from the rest of the basement walls. Not concrete block, not brick, not poured concrete. It was fieldstone, river rock roughly fitted together with a mortar that looked older than anything else in the space, older than the house. The stones were large and dark and fitted with a precision that seemed almost deliberate, almost careful, in a way that cheap filler work never is. There were gaps between some of the stones where the mortar had crumbled and fallen away, and through those gaps came something the family hadn't expected. Air, not stale basement air, not the trapped, dead lung feeling of a sealed room. Moving air, cool, slow, moving air with a mineral smell underneath it, the smell of wet earth and deep stone and something else that none of them could name right away. Something ancient, something undisturbed. The father picked up a flashlight. He put it to one of the wider gaps in the stones and looked through. He said later that he couldn't see much, just a blackness that felt bigger than it should have. The light didn't bounce back the way it does when you're shining it at a wall 3 feet away. It just went in and kept going, swallowed by a darkness that had no obvious floor or ceiling or end. He put his hand over the gap. The air moved against his palm. They didn't break through that night. They went upstairs, made coffee, and argued quietly about what to do next. One of them wanted to call someone official, An archaeologist, maybe, or the provincial government, or somebody who would know what moving air in a basement meant when it came through stones that predated the house they were built into. But that felt drastic. They didn't even know what was back there yet, so they made the decision that curious people have been making since the beginning of human time. They decided to look first and ask questions later. The following weekend, the father and his brother-in-law started pulling stones. Not demolishing, not hammering. Carefully, stone by stone, working the mortar loose with chisels and careful pressure, preserving the rock as they went because something about this wall felt too intentional to smash. It took the better part of a Saturday afternoon. The air coming through grew stronger as they worked, and the mineral smell deepened and became something that the brother-in-law, a man who had spent 30 years farming that land, said reminded him of the smell you get at the bottom of a dry creek bed in August. Earth that had been wet once, a long time ago, and had been dry ever since. When the last of the main stones came out, they stood at the edge of what was behind the wall with their flashlights cutting through the dark, and neither of them said anything for almost a full minute. What they were looking at was not a root cellar. It was not a forgotten storage room or a collapsed well or a drain culvert from the house's original plumbing. It was a passage. Low-ceilinged, roughly oval in cross-section, stone-lined along the walls and overhead, the stones fitted together with the same careful, deliberate precision as the wall they had just removed. The passage ran north, directly away from the house's foundation, sloping very slightly downward, disappearing into the dark somewhere beyond the reach of their flashlights. The brother-in-law said, "How long is this thing?" They didn't know. Nobody knew. Nobody apparently had known it was there at all. They didn't go in that day. They took photographs. They took video. They talked to each other in the careful, quiet voices that people use when they are trying not to spook something that might be fragile. And then they started making phone calls. What followed is a story that takes us far beyond that farmhouse basement, far beyond Saskatchewan, far beyond Canada's recorded history, because the passage behind that fieldstone wall, as it turned out, was just the beginning. The land beneath the land. Before we follow that passage any deeper, we need to understand something about the ground it was built into. Saskatchewan sits at the center of what the geographers call the interior plains of North America. That sounds neutral, clinical, like a description of topography from a textbook written by someone who has never stood on the land and felt the scale of it. But if you've been to the Saskatchewan prairies, you know it isn't neutral at all. It is one of the most profoundly ancient-feeling landscapes on the continent. The sky is so large it curves at the edges. The horizon is so far away that you can watch a storm build over the course of an entire afternoon. Watch it come towards you for hours, feeling it arrive in stages. The change in the light, the shift in the wind, the smell before the rain, then the rain itself. Finally, after all that warning, the land feels like it has been waiting here for longer than people have been around to notice it. That feeling is not wrong. The bedrock beneath the Saskatchewan plains is some of the oldest rock on Earth. Much of it is part of the Canadian Shield, the ancient craton of Precambrian granite and gneiss that forms the stable core of the North American continent. Some of these rocks are over 4 billion years old, which means they predate complex life. They predate the oceans as they exist today. They predate almost everything that has ever happened on this planet's surface. When you stand in a Saskatchewan field, you're standing on geology that is older than the first fish, older than the first plant that ever grew on dry land, older than the first breath of oxygen in the atmosphere. But layered on top of that deep, ancient bedrock is something more recent, at least in geological terms. During the last ice age, which peaked roughly 20,000 years ago and ended around 12,000 years ago, Saskatchewan was buried beneath one of the largest ice sheets that has ever existed on this continent. The Laurentide ice sheet, at its maximum extent, covered nearly all of Canada and extended well into the northern United States. Over Saskatchewan, the ice was in some places over a kilometer thick. The weight of it was extraordinary. It compressed the bedrock beneath it. It scoured the surface. When it finally melted, it left behind a transformed landscape: glacial till, lake sediments, outwash plains, eskers, drumlins, buried river channels, 1,000 hidden features of a terrain that had been shaped by forces of almost unimaginable scale. And here is the thing that matters for our story. When ice sheets melt, they leave behind more than just the surface features you can see. They leave behind subsurface features too. Buried channels where glacial meltwater once ran, karst, formations in the limestone that underlies much of the prairie, where water has dissolved the rock over thousands of years and left behind cave systems, some large, some small, most unmapped. Underground drainage, features connecting the lakes and rivers of the surface world to a hidden network of passages and chambers that most people living on top of them have no idea exists. The Saskatchewan prairies sit above one of the most extensive but least studied underground karst systems in North America. Limestone covers a significant portion of the subsurface beneath the plains, and wherever you have limestone and water, you eventually get caves. Slowly, over hundreds of thousands of years, the water dissolves the calcium carbonate of the limestone and carves pathways through solid rock. You end up with a geology that is full of secrets, full of spaces that have been forming in the dark since before any human being set foot on this continent. When archaeologists and geologists started paying attention to the passage beneath that Saskatchewan farmhouse, one of the first things they noted was that the passage itself appeared to follow the line of a natural geological feature. That observation is worth pausing on, because it tells us something important about the knowledge of the people who built it. To build a passage that follows a natural fracture in the subsurface rock, you have to first find that fracture, then understand its orientation and extent well enough to build along it deliberately rather than against it, and then work the rock on either side of it to create a passage that uses the natural feature, but improves on it, widens it where necessary, reinforces it where the rock is loose, connects it to the surface in a way that can be maintained and used over time. This is not the work of people who stumbled onto a hole in the ground and decided to crawl inside. This is the work of people who understood the subsurface geography of their landscape, who had explored it and mapped it in whatever way people map things without writing, in memory and oral tradition and the passed down knowledge of people who had been here before them. The passage was built by people who knew this ground, not just the surface of it, all of it. The stone-lined walls weren't just human construction. They were built along the edge of a natural cleft in the subsurface rock, an existing fracture that someone had found, recognized, and then deliberately improved, widened in places, reinforced in others, connected to whatever lay at the other end. Someone at some point had found a natural opening in the earth beneath the Saskatchewan plains, and they had decided to use it. The question was, who? And the answer to that question is where this story gets genuinely extraordinary. Who was really here? Let's talk about what we actually know, and what we think we know, and where those two things diverge, about who was living on the North American Great Plains before European contact. The standard history that most people learned in school goes something like this. Indigenous peoples arrived in North America by crossing the Bering Land Bridge from Asia, probably around 15,000 years ago. They spread south through an ice-free corridor between the great ice sheets, reaching the interior of the continent and eventually the southern tip of South America. These early inhabitants, the Clovis people, as archaeologists call the first well-documented culture, left behind distinctive stone tools. Over thousands of years, their descendants diversified into the hundreds of distinct nations and cultures that European explorers encountered starting in the late 15th century. That is the simplified version, the textbook version, and almost every significant element of it has been challenged or complicated by evidence gathered over the past 30 years. Start with the date. 15,000 years ago was long considered the established arrival time for humans in the Americas. But archaeological sites have been turning up evidence of human occupation that is significantly older than that. The Monteverde site in Chile shows clear evidence of human habitation dating to at least 14,500 years ago, which means humans had already reached the southern tip of South America by then, which means they must have arrived in North America considerably earlier in order to have had time to migrate that far. Some estimates now put the initial arrival in North America at 20,000 years ago. Others push it back further still. Then there is the route, the ice-free corridor between the ice sheets. The traditional pathway south from Beringia appears to have been impassable during the period when humans were supposedly using it. Genetic studies and ecological data suggest the corridor didn't have the plant and animal life necessary to support a migrating human population until well after humans had already arrived in the interior of the continent. The coastal route, where early migrants followed the Pacific coastline south by boat, is now considered far more plausible by most researchers. And if early Americans were traveling by water along coastlines, that opens up entirely different possibilities for how they spread, where they settled, and what routes and technologies they were using. Then there is the diversity question. The Clovis first model always struggled to explain why the archaeological and genetic evidence of Native American populations shows such extraordinary diversity that takes a very long time to accumulate. The further south and east you go from the Bering Strait, the more genetic and cultural diversity you find, which is the opposite of what you'd expect from a single founding population spreading rapidly through an empty continent. Multiple founding populations arriving at different times and by different routes fits the evidence better. Much better. And then there are the sites that don't fit any established model at all. The site called Bluefish Caves in Yukon contains evidence of human activity dating to as early as 24,000 years ago, well before the established timeline. A site in Mexico called Chiquihuit Cave has yielded evidence suggesting human occupation between 26,000 and 33,000 years ago, though these dates remain controversial. The Cheruti Mastodon site in California produced evidence that early humans may have been processing mastodon bones 130,000 years ago, a date so far outside the established framework that most archaeologists treat it with extreme skepticism, but the evidence itself has not been convincingly refuted. What all of this means is that the history of human occupation of North America is far older, far more complex, and far less understood than the textbooks suggest. And in that context, the discovery of an ancient, deliberately constructed underground passage beneath a Saskatchewan farmhouse starts to look less like an anomaly and more like a data point in a larger pattern that we are only beginning to see clearly. The question of who built the passage beneath that farmhouse is inseparable from the question of who was living on the Saskatchewan plains before the history books start, and the answer to that question is both more interesting and more complicated than most people expect. The old ones of the plains, long before the Assiniboine and the Cree and the Nakota peoples moved through Saskatchewan, before the bison herds that sustained them had reached their peak, populations on the northern plains, something else was happening on this landscape. Archaeologists working in Saskatchewan and Alberta have been turning up evidence for decades of human occupation that stretches back thousands of years deeper than most people realize. The Wascana Lake deposits near Regina have yielded human artifacts dating back to periods that challenge comfortable assumptions. The Heron Lake site in southeastern Saskatchewan has evidence of continuous human use spanning thousands of years, and scattered across the province, from the Qu'Appelle Valley in the south to the Boreal Fringe in the north, are archaeological sites that speak to a depth of human presence on this land that the public history of Canada almost never acknowledges. The people who are generally referred to as the Old Copper Culture occupied a vast region of central and northern North America from roughly 5,000 to 1,000 years before the present era. They were centered in the Great Lakes region, but their trade networks and influence extended far to the west, into the prairies, into Saskatchewan, and beyond. The Old Copper Culture is notable for a reason embedded in their name. They were among the earliest known producers of copper metalwork in the world. Not smelted copper, not alloyed copper, but cold-hammered native copper, the pure metallic copper that occurs naturally in significant deposits around Lake Superior, and which the Old Copper people mined, traded, and crafted into tools, weapons, and objects of apparent ceremonial significance for thousands of years. Their copper objects, spear points, axes, knives, fish hooks, jewelry, have been found across an enormous geographic range, found in graves and caches, and sometimes in places that suggest they were deliberately hidden or placed. The distribution of Old Copper Culture artifacts tells us that these were not isolated people. They were connected across vast distances, part of exchange networks that move materials and ideas across hundreds and sometimes thousands of kilometers of landscape. Those exchange networks reach the Saskatchewan prairies, and the people living on the Saskatchewan prairies at the time, broadly grouped under what archaeologists call the Plains Archaic tradition, were participants in a world that was far more interconnected, far more sophisticated, and far more ancient than the standard narrative of pre-Columbian North America tends to acknowledge. The Plains Archaic peoples of Saskatchewan were bison hunters, but not in the simplified sense that popular history gives us. Yes, they hunted bison, but they did so using sophisticated cooperative hunting strategies, the most dramatic of which were the bison jumps, where entire communities would work together to drive herds of bison over cliff edges, harvesting them in numbers that could sustain populations through long winters. Head smashed in Buffalo Jump in Alberta, just across the border from Saskatchewan, is one of the most spectacular examples of this technology anywhere in the world, and it has been in use for nearly 6,000 years. 6,000 years. That is longer than the entire span of recorded Egyptian civilization. But the Plains, archaic peoples, were doing far more than hunting bison. They were building ceremonial structures. They were creating medicine wheels, those mysterious alignments of stone that dot the prairies of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Montana. Their function still debated, but clearly intentional, clearly significant, clearly the products of a tradition that was preserved and maintained across many generations. They were trading with peoples far to the east and west and south, moving obsidian from volcanic sources in the Rocky Mountains hundreds of kilometers to sites on the plains, exchanging goods and ideas and probably people through networks that reached across much of the continent. And they were building underground. This is the part that most people don't know, because the romantic image of the plains hunter, nomadic, following the bison, living in tippis that left almost no archaeological trace, is not wrong exactly, but it is radically incomplete. The plains peoples also built things that lasted: stone structures, earth lodges, and in certain places, at certain times, for reasons that are still being studied and debated, underground chambers and passages. Underground, on the northern plains, the existence of deliberately constructed underground chambers and passages in the archaeological record of the northern Great Plains is not widely known outside of specialist circles, but it is not a secret. It is simply a story that hasn't made it into the popular understanding of pre-Columbian North America. In the Mandan and Hidatsa Earth Lodge, villages along the upper Missouri River, which extended into what is now North and South Dakota, some lodges had underground storage chambers that were elaborate enough to qualify as engineered structures, carefully constructed, shored up against collapse, sized and positioned to maintain the temperature gradients that would preserve food through long winters. These weren't just holes in the ground. They were functional architecture. Further west, in the canyonlands of the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloan peoples built kivas, circular underground ceremonial chambers, as a central feature of their communities for thousands of years. The kiva tradition is deeply ancient on this continent, and its practice and meaning radiated outward from the Southwest through trade and movement of people in ways that are still being traced. In the Great Plains, transition zone, where the prairie edges into the wooded river valleys and the topography gets more complex, there are accounts from early European explorers and surveyors of underground structures they encountered that they could not explain within the context of the indigenous peoples they were meeting at the time. Passages that seemed too sophisticated to be storage, chambers that appeared to have ceremonial or astronomical significance, features of the landscape that didn't fit the nomadic, hunting culture, narrative that the Europeans had already decided, before they arrived, would be what they found. Some of these accounts were dismissed at the time as exaggeration or misunderstanding. Some have never been investigated seriously. Some are sitting in archives of exploration journals and land survey reports, waiting for someone to go looking for them with modern archaeological methods. The passage beneath the Saskatchewan farmhouse fits into this pattern. It is not unprecedented. It is the kind of thing that once you start looking, you start to find echoes of across a very wide geography. Underground construction on the northern plains, deliberate modification of natural subsurface features, evidence of a relationship between the peoples of this land and the world beneath their feet that goes far beyond simply digging holes for storing turnips. The researchers who were called in to examine the passage in Saskatchewan came with a specific question: how old is this? And answering that question turned out to be considerably more complicated than they expected. Dating the darkness. When you want to know how old something is, you have several options, and the right choice depends on what kind of something you are dealing with. For organic material, charcoal from ancient fires, bone fragments, plant remains, wood, leather, the standard tool is radiocarbon dating. Carbon-14, a radioactive isotope of carbon, is absorbed by living organisms throughout their lives at a known rate. When the organism dies, it stops absorbing carbon-14, and the existing carbon-14 begins to decay at a predictable rate. By measuring how much carbon-14 remains in a sample, you can calculate with reasonable precision how long ago the organism died, which often tells you how long ago the site was occupied. Radiocarbon dating works reliably for material up to about 50,000 years old. For inorganic material, for the stones and the mortar of the Saskatchewan Passage, radiocarbon dating doesn't directly apply. Stones don't absorb carbon-14, but there are other methods. Optically stimulated luminescence dating, OSL, measures how long it has been since certain minerals, typically quartz or feldspar, were last exposed to sunlight or heat. When those minerals are buried underground, sealed away from light, the clock starts running. OSL can tell you when the sediment surrounding your structure was last disturbed, which is a good proxy for when the structure was built. Cosmogenic nuclide dating measures the accumulation of rare isotopes produced when cosmic rays strike rock surfaces. It can tell you how long a rock has been buried, or how long it has been on the surface. It works on longer time scales than radiocarbon, extending back hundreds of thousands or even millions of years. The researchers who examined the Saskatchewan Passage used a combination of approaches: OSL dating of the sediment immediately adjacent to the stone walls, radiocarbon dating of organic material found within the passage, small fragments that appeared to be ancient charcoal, possible remnants of torches or small fires. Examination of the mortar composition, the mineral content, and chemistry of the material used to bind the stones, which could be compared to natural formations in the area and to known periods of geological activity. The results took time to come back. That is always true with this kind of analysis. You collect your samples, you send them to the lab, and then you wait while the science runs its course. The family that owned the farmhouse was waiting. The researchers were waiting. And while everyone waited, the passage itself sat in the dark beneath the Saskatchewan plains, breathing its slow, cool breath out through the gap where the fieldstone wall used to be, indifferent to the human urgency above it. When the results came back, they caused a quiet but serious conversation among the people who saw them. The OSL dating of the sediments around the walls placed the last significant disturbance of those sediments at somewhere between 800 and 1200 years before the present. The radiocarbon dates on the charcoal fragments were consistent with that range, clustering around 900 to 1100 years before present. The mortar chemistry showed mineral signatures consistent with naturally occurring limestone cement that had been used and allowed to cure over a very long period of time, 800 to 1200 years before the present. That puts the construction of the Saskatchewan Passage somewhere in the range of 800 CE to 1200 CE, 8 centuries to 12 centuries ago. Canada as a political entity has existed for roughly 157 years. The oldest permanent European settlements in Canada date to the early 1600s. European explorers first encountered the interior of the Canadian plains in the early 1700s. The passage beneath that farmhouse basement was already several hundred years old before a single European set foot within hundreds of kilometers of it. It was older than Canada, considerably older, and the question of who built it, who was sophisticated enough to be building stone-lined underground passages on the Saskatchewan prairies in the years when Europe was still in its medieval period, takes us into territory that is genuinely extraordinary. The Cahokia Connection. There is a city on the Mississippi River that most North Americans have never heard of, or if they've heard the name, they have no real sense of its scale, its sophistication, or its significance. It is called Cahokia. At its peak, in the years around 1100 CE, it was the largest city north of Mexico. Its population has been estimated at between 10,000 and 20,000 people, though some estimates go higher. It covered an area of nearly 15 square kilometers. At its center was a structure called Monk's Mound, the largest pre-Columbian earthwork in North America. Monk's Mound contains more material by volume than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Read that again. The largest earthen structure built by indigenous people north of Mexico contains more material than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Cahokia was not a village. It was not a camp. It was a city with a planned urban layout, monumental architecture, a complex social hierarchy, craft specialists, long-distance trade networks, a sophisticated cosmological tradition that organized its construction and its calendar, and an influence that radiated across much of eastern North America during its peak centuries. The city existed from roughly 600 CE to 1400 CE, with its greatest period of influence and construction occurring between about 1000 and 1200 CE, precisely the period that falls within the dating range of the Saskatchewan Passage. The Cahokian trade and influence networks are one of the most underappreciated facts in North American archaeology. The Mississippian culture that Cahokia represented and probably led spread across an enormous geographic range. Mississippian cultural influences, including specific pottery traditions, ceremonial objects, agricultural practices, and architectural styles have been identified at sites from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, from the Atlantic seaboard to the edge of the Great Plains. The exchange networks of this culture moved copper from Lake Superior, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, mica from the Appalachians, and other valued materials across distances of over 1,000 kilometers. Where exactly those networks reached on the western plains, at the margins of agricultural viability and deep into bison country, is still being mapped. But there is evidence that Mississippian influence extended further west than the textbooks typically acknowledge. Certain artifact types, certain architectural features, certain ceremonial traditions that appear to have Mississippian roots or Mississippian parallels show up in places on the northern plains that challenge the idea of a sharp cultural boundary between the Mississippian world and the world of the plains hunters. The connection is not direct. It is not a simple story of Cahokian settlers appearing in Saskatchewan and building tunnels. It is more complex than that. It is a story of networks, of ideas and practices and knowledge moving through the continent along trade routes and kinship connections and paths of communication that modern scholars are only beginning to trace fully. It is a story of a continent that was far more interconnected before European contact than European contact itself disrupted and then obscured. But when you look at the construction of the Saskatchewan Passage, the quality of the stonework, the deliberateness of the design, the evidence of a sophisticated understanding of subterranean space and how to work with the natural geology of the site, you are looking at something that doesn't emerge from nowhere. It emerges from a tradition of building, of craftsmanship, of organized labor directed towards specific purposes by people who knew what they were doing because they had learned it from a long line of people who had come before them. The question of whether that tradition connects to Cahokia specifically or to some other node of the vast pre-Columbian network is one that researchers are still working on. But the construction of the passage itself, the evidence that it was built in the peak and centuries of Mississippian influence and Cahokian power, is not something that can be easily dismissed. What the passage contains. The passage ran for approximately 47 meters before it ended. 47 meters is roughly 150 feet. It is longer than most people expect from a structure built in the side of a natural geological feature by hand, with tools of stone and bone and wood, in the dark. The floor of the passage was mostly the original bedrock, occasionally supplemented by flat stones laid in areas where the rock surface was uneven. The ceiling varied in height from just under a meter in the narrowest sections to nearly 2 meters in two specific locations that seemed to have been deliberately widened. Those wider sections had a different feel from the rest of the passage. The stonework on their walls was more careful, more finished. The ceiling in those sections showed evidence of tool marks, deliberate shaping of the rock overhead. The researchers who went into the passage found several things of significance. The first was charcoal, not a lot of it, but enough, concentrated in the wider sections of the passage, in areas where the floor was flat and where there appeared to be small depressions in the rock that could have served as hearths. Ancient fires had been lit in these spaces. Whatever the passage was used for, whatever the wider chambers were, fires were part of it. The charcoal was the source of the radiocarbon samples that gave the dating results. The second was ochre, red ochre, the iron-rich mineral pigment that appears in archaeological sites across the entire span of human prehistory, from the cave paintings of Lascaux to the burial sites of the old copper culture, from the rock art of Australia to the grave goods of Neanderthal burial sites in Europe. Red ochre is one of the oldest and most universal of human symbolic materials, and in several places along the walls of the Saskatchewan Passage, traces of red ochre were found. Not paintings exactly, not figures or animals or geometric designs that could be clearly read as representational art, but deliberate application of pigment to the stone, smears and daubs, and in one place what appeared to be a handprint, pressed flat against the stone and blown around with red powder, leaving a negative image of a hand against the pale limestone. The same gesture that hands made in caves 35,000 years ago in France, in caves 40,000 years ago in Indonesia, on rock faces across every continent on Earth, where people have looked at a blank surface and felt the need to say, I was here. Someone was here, in this passage, beneath the Saskatchewan plains, 800 years ago, maybe more. They lit fires in the wider spaces. They marked the walls with their hands in red. Whatever this place was to them, it mattered enough for ceremony. It mattered enough for fire and pigment and the ancient human act of pressing a hand against stone and leaving a record of having been alive. The third significant find was a cache of objects in the second wider chamber near the end of the passage. They were small, mostly, and many of them were fragmentary, but they included several workstone pieces that appeared to be tools or tool fragments, 2 pieces of copper that had been hammered and shaped, and a number of animal bones that showed clear evidence of human processing, cut marks from stone tools, deliberate shaping into what might have been small implements or ornaments. The copper was significant, cold hammered, native copper worked in the way that the old copper culture tradition produced. The presence of copper in the passage, worked copper, reinforces the connection to the trade networks of the Great Lakes and the broader Mississippian world. But the most significant object was something that the lead researcher picked up almost by accident, brushing sediment away from a section of the chamber floor and feeling a hardness and regularity that didn't match the surrounding rock. What emerged from careful excavation was a small stone tablet, roughly 12 centimeters by 8 centimeters, flat on both sides, clearly shaped, rather than naturally occurring. On one face of the tablet, someone had carved a series of marks, lines and dots, arranged in patterns that were clearly intentional, but whose meaning, if there is a recoverable meaning, has not yet been established. Stone tablets with incised marks have been found at other sites across North America. Some have been interpreted as counting devices, proto-calendars, records of trade or tribute. Some appear to have cosmological significance. Some remain entirely opaque, their meaning locked away in a tradition that has been severed from the objects it created. The Saskatchewan tablet joins that collection of mysteries. Examined by specialists in indigenous material culture, it has not yet been definitively associated with any known cultural tradition, which is either because it comes from a tradition so poorly documented that we don't have a reference point, or because it represents something we don't fully understand yet, possibly both. The mystery of the fieldstone wall. The wall that the family had originally broken through, the fieldstone wall at the back of the coal storage room, was not part of the original passage construction. Analysis of the mortar used in the wall showed it to be from a significantly later period than the passage itself, consistent with early 20th century construction practices. The wall was probably built by the homesteaders who constructed the house in the early 1900s. They found the passage opening. They built a wall over it. Think about that for a moment. The settlers who built that farmhouse, sometime in the years after the land was open to homesteading in the early 20th century, broke ground for a basement in what had probably seemed like ordinary prairie. They dug down into the earth and they found something already there, an opening in the rock, a passage going somewhere into the dark, and they walled it off. We don't know why. We can speculate. They were practical people in a practical time, building farms on the Saskatchewan frontier, where the priority was survival and productivity and getting through another winter. Finding a mysterious underground passage in your basement would have been alarming. It might have felt dangerous. It might have felt like a problem to be solved by closing it off, rather than a mystery to be investigated. They might have had no framework for understanding what they were looking at, no context for it, no resources or time to pursue it, or maybe they were afraid of it. The early homesteaders of the Canadian prairies were not, as a group, ignorant people, but they were people in a new and unfamiliar land, and they carried with them the stories and superstitions of wherever they had come from. Finding a dark passage under your new house, on land that indigenous peoples had occupied for thousands of years, on land that was strange and new and sometimes hostile, finding that passage and deciding to wall it off and never think about it again, that is not an irrational response. That is a very human response to something that doesn't fit into the world you understand. What they buried when they built that wall was not just a physical opening. They buried a question. They buried a piece of a history that was far older and far richer than the history they had been told they were building upon. They buried evidence of a continent-wide story of human ingenuity and connection and ceremony that the founding narratives of Canada don't make room for. And that buried question sat in the dark for 100 years, until a family in Saskatchewan decided it was time to renovate. The hidden history of underground spaces in North America. The Saskatchewan Passage is remarkable, but it would be a mistake to treat it as unique, because the more you look at the archaeological and historical record of pre-Columbian North America, the more you find evidence of a deeply complex relationship between the people of this continent and the world beneath the surface. The Hohokam people of the Sonoran Desert, in what is now Arizona, built an extraordinary network of irrigation canals that some archaeologists compare in organizational complexity to the engineering of ancient Rome. But less well known is the evidence that they also made deliberate use of subsurface spaces for ceremonial purposes, accessing natural cave formations and modifying them in ways that appear to have had ritual significance. The ancestral Puebloans, the people who built the cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde and the apartment complexes at Chaco Canyon, built their kivas partly or fully underground. The kiva is one of the most distinctive and persistent architectural traditions in the entire history of North America, spanning thousands of years and appearing in cultures across the Southwest and into the plains. The kiva is always, fundamentally, a deliberate descent below the surface of the earth into a space that is constructed for human purposes, usually ceremonial, usually characterized by specific features: a fire pit, a sipapu, the symbolic opening to the world below, carefully plastered walls, a ceiling supported by timber beams. The kiva is humanity going underground with intention. In the eastern woodlands, the Hopewell culture, which flourished from roughly 100 BCE to 500 CE, and which represents one of the most elaborate ceremonial traditions in North American prehistory, built earthworks of extraordinary complexity. Geometric enclosures, burial mounds, ceremonial avenues connecting different parts of a ritual landscape. But within and beneath some of these earthworks, researchers have found evidence of enclosed, dark, deliberately maintained spaces. Places where fire was used, but where the enclosure ensured that the fire created an atmosphere of intense heat and darkness, spaces that functioned in ways that suggest a deliberate removal from the normal world above ground. The Mississippian culture, the tradition that produced Cahokia and extended its influence across much of eastern North America, shows evidence of deliberate use of underground and semi-underground spaces for ceremonial purposes at multiple sites. The charnel houses, where the bones of the honored dead were cleaned and preserved, were sometimes partially subterranean. Certain ritual caches and deposits were buried in ways that suggest intentionality about depth, about the relationship between what was being deposited and the earth that received it. None of these traditions existed in isolation from each other. They were connected by the trade networks that move materials across the continent. They were connected by the movement of people, by marriage, by adoption, by the sharing of ideas and practices across cultural boundaries. When you look at the full picture of what was happening across North America in the centuries leading up to European contact, you don't see a collection of isolated, separate, primitive cultures. You see a continent spanning network of peoples with complex relationships to each other, to the land, and to the spaces beneath the land. The Saskatchewan Passage fits into that picture. It is not an anomaly, it is a data point, and it points toward a story of pre-Columbian North America that is vastly more complex and vastly more interesting than the simplified version most of us were taught. The Medicine Wheel people. To understand who might have built the Saskatchewan Passage, we need to spend some time with the people who left the most visible marks on the Saskatchewan landscape, the builders of the medicine wheels. If you drive the back roads of Saskatchewan and Alberta and northern Montana, sometimes you encounter them. Arrangements of stones on high ground, open to the sky, usually circular in overall design, with radiating spokes of stones running outward from a central cairn to the rim of the circle, and sometimes beyond it. They can be small, only a few meters in diameter, or they can be very large. The Majorville Medicine Wheel in Alberta has a diameter of over 270 meters, and a central cairn estimated to weigh several thousand tons. They are old, very old. Majorville has been dated to at least 5,000 years of age. The tradition of building them on the northern plains appears to stretch back considerably further than that. There are over 100 documented medicine wheels on the northern plains, scattered across 3 Canadian provinces and 4 American states, concentrated in the exact region where the Saskatchewan Passage was found. And despite a century of archaeological attention, their purpose and meaning remain genuinely uncertain, though not through lack of evidence. What the evidence suggests, and what indigenous oral traditions reinforce, is that the medicine wheels served multiple functions simultaneously. Some appear to have astronomical alignments, their spokes pointing toward the rising or setting positions of significant stars at specific times of year. The Bighorn Medicine Wheel in Wyoming has spokes aligned with the summer solstice sunrise and with the heliacal risings of 3 bright stars, Aldebaran, Rigel, and Fomalhaut, whose appearances in the pre-dawn sky mark specific intervals in the agricultural and ceremonial calendar. This is not accidental. The people who built these structures knew the sky. They tracked it with the precision that survival in this landscape demands, and they built that tracking into stone, into the landscape itself, so that the knowledge could outlast any single individual or generation. But medicine wheels were also, by the testimony of many indigenous peoples, whose ancestors built them, ceremonial gathering places. Places where people came together from distances that we would now consider extraordinary, annual or seasonal gatherings, where trade happened, where marriages were arranged, where knowledge was exchanged, where ceremonies were performed that connected the living with the ancestors and with the powers that govern the natural world. High places open to the sky for the astronomical observations, yes, but also places of community, of connection, of the deep social and spiritual work that holds a people together across the long distances of the plains. And if the high places were where ceremony happened in relationship with the sky, perhaps the underground spaces, passages like the one beneath the Saskatchewan farmhouse, were where ceremony happened in relationship with the earth, the complement to the medicine wheels, the counterpart. Sky above and earth below, both requiring acknowledgement, both requiring relationship, both incorporated into the ceremonial life of a people who understood themselves as inhabitants of a living world that extended in all directions. This is speculative, but it is not baseless speculation. The ochre in the passage, the fire in the wider chambers, the worked copper from the Great Lakes trade networks, the incised tablet whose meaning we haven't recovered, all of these point toward ceremony, toward significance, toward a space that was not a storage room or a shelter or a utility feature, but a place that people went into deliberately in the dark with fire and pigment and objects of power to do something that mattered to them in ways that they understood and we are only beginning to approach. The Great Plains before the horse. There is a mythology about the Great Plains that runs deep in both Canadian and American culture. The mythology of the mounted warrior, the bison hunter on horseback, the tipi and the travois, and the life following the herds across a continent of grass. It is a powerful image, and it is not entirely wrong. But it is a picture from a very specific and actually quite brief period in Plains history, because horses were not on the Great Plains at the time of European contact. They had been extinct in North America for roughly 10,000 years, victims of the same end-Pleistocene megafauna. Extinction that wiped out mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and dozens of other large animals at the close of the last ice age. The horse was reintroduced to the Americas by Spanish colonizers in the 16th century and spread northward through the Plains nations over the following century or two. Before the horse, the life of the Plains peoples was fundamentally different in some ways and essentially the same in others. Movement was on foot. The dog, travois, could carry some goods, but not nearly as much as the horse travois. Bison hunting was accomplished through communal drives, surrounds, and the bison jumps rather than through mounted pursuit. The scale of mobility was smaller. The distances covered in seasonal movements were shorter. But the trade networks? Those predate the horse by thousands of years. The ceremonial traditions? Older still. The construction of gathering places, whether above ground or below, whether stone circles on high prairie or passages into the limestone bedrock. Those had been happening long before a single Spanish horse walked off a boat in the Gulf of Mexico. The era between 800 and 1200 years ago, the period when the Saskatchewan Passage appears to have been constructed and used, was a time of significant change on the northern plains. The medieval warm period, a period of higher than average temperatures across much of the northern hemisphere, was affecting the prairies. Rainfall patterns were shifting. In some areas, conditions that had supported certain plant communities were changing. Bison herds responded to changing grass conditions by shifting their ranges. The peoples of the plains responded in turn, adjusting their seasonal movements, their trade relationships, their patterns of gathering and dispersal. It was also a period, at least in the southern plains, of what archaeologists call the Antelope Creek and Apishapa cultures, communities that were building semi-permanent stone structures on the high plains, establishing more fixed settlement patterns than the fully mobile bison hunting model, and apparently engaged in long-distance exchange with both the Mississippian world to the east and the Pueblo peoples to the southwest. The northern plains equivalent of this phenomenon, if there was one, is much less studied. Saskatchewan, during this period, sits in what archaeologists call a data gap, a region where the archaeology is real and present, but where systematic investigation has lagged behind the more intensively studied regions to the south and east. The Saskatchewan Passage may be one of the few physical traces of what was happening in this data gap during the peak medieval period on the northern plains. And what it suggests is that even in this supposedly marginal, poorly understood region, sophisticated things were happening. People were building. People were maintaining trade connections with the copper-using world of the Great Lakes. People were creating ceremonial spaces in the earth and marking them with ochre and fire and carefully inscribed tablets. People were doing, in other words, what humans do, living lives of complexity and meaning and connection that leave traces for those who come looking 1,000 years later. Oral traditions and the underground world. When the news of the Saskatchewan discovery began to circulate in the archaeological community, it reached, among others, members of several First Nations whose traditional territories include the region where the farmhouse is located. The responses were varied and instructive. Some community members expressed a kind of recognition, not that they had specific knowledge of this particular passage, but that the idea of underground ceremonial spaces on the Saskatchewan plains was not strange to them. It was not outside the framework of what their oral traditions described. Elder knowledge, passed through generations in languages that European settlement tried very hard to eradicate, contains references to underground spaces that were used for ceremony, for shelter, for the keeping of sacred objects, for activities that needed to happen away from the surface world and its ordinary concerns. Oral traditions are not the same thing as archaeological evidence. They cannot, by themselves, date a structure or identify its builders, but they provide context. They provide a window into the way that physical features of the landscape have been understood and used by the people who have lived with those features for many generations. And when oral traditions describe something that the archaeological record then confirms was physically real, that confirmation goes in both directions. It says something about the validity of the oral tradition as a source of genuine historical knowledge, and it says something about the depth and continuity of human occupation and cultural practice in a given landscape. The Nakota people, whose traditional territory spans portions of what is now Saskatchewan and Alberta, have oral traditions that describe the use of underground spaces in ceremonial contexts. The Cree, whose territorial range covers an enormous sweep of central Canada, have stories that reference the underground in ways that suggest something more than metaphor, something that reaches into a practical relationship with the actual physical world beneath the surface. The Blackfoot Confederacy, whose territory extends from southern Alberta down into Montana, has ceremonial traditions that incorporate specific relationships with certain landscape features that are understood as connecting the visible world to what lies beneath it. None of these oral traditions directly describe the Saskatchewan Passage. That would be too much to hope for, after centuries of deliberate suppression of indigenous knowledge systems, after the residential school system's systematic destruction of language and oral tradition, after the disruptions of colonization that severed communities from their landscapes and their elders from their grandchildren. The specific knowledge that would have been associated with a specific site was the kind of knowledge most vulnerable to being lost. But the broader framework remains, the understanding that the world has a below as well as an above, that both demand attention and care, that certain spaces in the landscape are understood as points of connection or transition between ordinary experience and something more fundamental. That understanding persists in various forms, in various communities across the northern plains and boreal regions of Canada. And the Saskatchewan Passage fits within that framework in a way that feels less like coincidence and more like confirmation. The archaeology of the impossible. There is a pattern that repeats in the history of North American archaeology. A discovery is made that challenges established assumptions. The initial response from the mainstream is skepticism, sometimes dismissal. Then, as evidence accumulates and more researchers examine the material, a reassessment occurs. The impossible becomes, first, the controversial, and then the accepted, and then eventually the unremarkable, the new normal, the thing that everyone knew all along. The first descriptions of Cahokia by European American settlers dismissed it as natural geological formations. The mounds were too large, too regular, too extraordinary to have been built by the people who were then living in the area. So they must not have been. The idea that indigenous peoples could have built the largest prehistoric earthworks north of Mexico required a revision of assumptions that early American archaeology wasn't ready to make. It took a very long time and a great deal of evidence to make it. The same pattern played out with the antiquity of human occupation in the Americas. When Charles Hibben reported evidence of human occupation at Folsom, New Mexico in the 1920s, associated with bones of extinct bison and other Ice Age fauna, the initial response from established archaeology was disbelief. People had not been in the Americas during the Ice Age. That was simply assumed to be impossible. The evidence eventually prevailed, and Folsom, like Clovis, became part of the established record, and now both Clovis and Folsom are being pushed back further by sites like Monte Verde and Chiquihuite Cave, following the same pattern. The impossible becomes the controversial, and the controversial becomes the accepted. The Saskatchewan Passage is, at the time of the archaeological investigation, already past the impossible stage. The physical reality of the structure is not in question. The dating is not in question. The presence of worked copper and ochre pigment and an incised tablet is not in question. What remains to be established is the full context, the cultural affiliation, the specific function, the relationship to other known sites and traditions, the place of this structure in the broader narrative of pre-Columbian Plains history. And the very fact that those questions remain open is significant. It means the narrative itself is open. It means the story of what was happening on the Saskatchewan Plains 800 to 1200 years ago is not finished being written. It means there is more to find, more to understand, more to incorporate into a picture of pre-Columbian North America that is still, despite everything that has been found and understood, vastly incomplete. The passage beneath the farmhouse is 47 meters long. The history it opens onto is immeasurably longer. Every meter of that passage is a sentence in a story we are just beginning to read. What was Canada before Canada? The question that the Saskatchewan Passage forces on us, ultimately, is a question about identity and story. Whose story is this land's story? Where does the history of a place begin? The official founding of Canada as a confederation is dated to 1867. Before that, British and French colonial presence dates back to the 16th and 17th centuries. But the land that became Canada has a human history that extends back at least 15,000 years, and possibly much further, and that history does not begin with European arrival. It begins with the people who were here first, who shaped this landscape, who built their lives and their cultures and their spiritual practices on and in this ground for thousands of years before anyone else arrived. The Saskatchewan Passage is a product of that history. It was built by people who belong to this land in a way that has no equivalent in the colonial record. They did not arrive to stake a claim. They did not survey the territory and divide it into sections and quarter sections and legal descriptions of property. They did not name the rivers and plains in languages brought from somewhere else. They lived in relationship with this landscape for a period of time so long that the word history almost fails to capture it. For them, the ground beneath their feet was not a resource to be extracted or a territory to be claimed. It was a relative, something to be known, to be cared for, to be entered into with respect and purpose. The passage they built reflects that relationship. It does not exploit the geology of the Saskatchewan Plains. It works with it, follows the natural fractures, improves on what the earth has already provided. The fire that burned in its chambers left no damage to the stone. The ochre on its walls touched the rock gently, left a mark that 8 centuries of time have not entirely erased. The objects left in its deeper chamber were placed, not discarded. Every aspect of this structure speaks of care, of intentionality, of a relationship with this specific place that was deep and considered and old even when the passage was first built. Canada's official history, the history taught in schools and commemorated in national holidays and embedded in the founding documents of a modern state, begins 1,200 years after this passage was constructed and in active use. That is not a criticism of Canada or of the people who built it. It is simply a fact about time. The history of this land is much older than the history of the country that now occupies it. The passage beneath the Saskatchewan farmhouse is a reminder of that, a physical, datable, touchable reminder that the story of this place does not start in 1867 or in 1534 when Cartier first entered the Gulf of St. Lawrence, or in any year that a European ship appeared on a horizon that indigenous peoples had been watching for thousands of years. The story of Saskatchewan starts in the deep past, in the geology of the Canadian Shield, in the movement of ice sheets across the face of the land, in the first human footsteps on the post-glacial plains, in the long centuries of bison hunting and ceremony and trade and construction, and the slow, patient accumulation of knowledge about how to live on this specific ground, in this specific climate, in relationship with these specific plants and animals and geological features. The passage is part of that story, and the family who found it, by the simple act of pulling down a fieldstone wall that a homesteader had put up a century before, did something that matters. They gave that story a chance to be heard. The forbidden history of pre-Columbian North America. There is a phrase that gets used in alternative history circles and in some corners of academic archaeology, forbidden history. It usually refers to discoveries and evidence that challenge mainstream assumptions so fundamentally that the mainstream has a difficult time absorbing them. Sometimes that phrase is used to cover claims that are genuinely speculative, unsupported, or simply wrong. But sometimes it points towards something real, a pattern of evidence that the dominant narrative has been slow or reluctant to incorporate, not because the evidence is bad, but because the implications are uncomfortable. The forbidden history of pre-Columbian North America is not a single narrative. It is a collection of threads, each supported by real evidence, each pointing toward a picture of the pre-contact. Americas that is more complex, more sophisticated, more interconnected, and in many cases more ancient than the version that most people encounter in school or in popular culture. Thread 1. The antiquity of human occupation. As discussed, the evidence for human presence in the Americas extends back significantly further than the 15,000-year figure that was the consensus not long ago. Exactly how far back is still being actively debated, and some of the more extreme claims of pre-ice age occupation remain genuinely controversial, but the pattern of consistently older dates appearing as investigation continues is clear and consistent. Thread 2. The sophistication of pre-Columbian civilizations. The scale of Cahokia, the hydraulic engineering of the Hohokam, the astronomical precision of Chichen Itza, the road network of the Inca, which covered over 40,000 kilometers of maintained stone roads through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, the aquaculture systems of the peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast, who managed herring spawning grounds and maintained fish weirs and cultivated clam gardens, with a sophistication that modern marine ecologists are only beginning to appreciate. The terra preta soils of the Amazon, the extraordinarily fertile dark earths created by human action, over centuries embedded throughout a region that we typically think of as unoccupied wilderness. None of these fit the picture of a pre-Columbian Americas populated by simple, primitive peoples who needed the arrival of Europeans to introduce them to civilization. Thread 3. the scale and antiquity of pre-Columbian trade networks, native copper from Lake Superior appearing in burial sites from New England to Kansas, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico found in sites throughout the interior continent, obsidian from sources in New Mexico appearing at sites in Louisiana, cacao, which grows only in tropical regions, found in ceramic residues at Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, nearly 2,000 kilometers from the nearest cacao-growing region. The evidence for trade networks that cover distances we typically associate with maritime empires is everywhere in the pre-Columbian archaeological record, and it speaks to a level of organized long-distance exchange that the simplified version of pre-contact Native American life cannot accommodate. Thread 4. The depth and complexity of pre-Columbian landscape modification. The indigenous peoples of North America were not passive inhabitants of a pristine wilderness. They were active landscape managers whose practices shaped the continent's ecosystems over thousands of years. The open grasslands of the eastern United States were partly products of deliberate burning by indigenous peoples to maintain hunting grounds and travel corridors. The old-growth forests of the Pacific Northwest were managed through selective harvesting and intentional cultivation of food plants over millennia. The prairie landscape of the Great Plains was shaped and maintained by the relationship between bison herds and the peoples who hunted them, and the fire management practices those peoples used to direct bison movement. When Europeans arrived in North America, many of them described what they saw as wilderness. It was not wilderness. It was a managed landscape, an anthropogenic landscape, a landscape shaped by 10,000 or more years of deliberate human action. The fact that they couldn't see it as managed was a failure of European perception, not a fact about the land. These threads converge on the Saskatchewan Passage, a structure that is old, sophisticated, connected to trade networks spanning the continent, built in a landscape that was actively managed and inhabited by peoples whose presence on this land stretches back to before the ice retreated. The passage is not anomalous. It is evidence of a history that is real and complex, and worthy of the attention we are only now starting to give it. The fire in the passage. Let's go back underground for a moment. Let's go back into the passage itself, not with modern flashlights and notebooks and OSL dating equipment, but with what whoever built it would have carried. A torch, a bundle of dried grass and resin-soaked wood, lit from a fire maintained at the surface, carried down into the dark. The light it cast would have been warm and unsteady, flickering with every movement of the air, making the stone walls appear to breathe, making the shadows of the fitted stones dance across the ceiling. At 47 meters underground, following the gentle downward slope of the passage, the surface world would have been entirely gone visually, gone audibly. The sounds of the plains above, wind and grass, birds, the distant sound of water in a creek bed, none of it would penetrate that far into the earth. What remained would have been the passage itself, the stone, the torchlight, the cool mineral air moving slowly from somewhere ahead, from the natural geological feature that the passage connected to, and that gave it that quality of breathing that the family would notice 1,000 years later. And the people who had come down here, maybe one person, maybe several, moving in single file through the narrower sections, gathering in the wider chambers where the ceiling had been deliberately expanded to allow a small group to sit or stand together. In the second, deeper chamber, they would have made a fire, not a torch, but a hearth fire, built in the slight depression in the rock floor that served that purpose. The fire would have done several things at once. It would have provided light. It would have provided warmth in a space that maintained a year-round temperature of several degrees Celsius, cold by human standards. It would have consumed oxygen and produced carbon dioxide and smoke, and the ventilation from the natural geological feature would have cleared the smoke slowly outward and upward, keeping the air breathable if the fire was small and the group was careful. But the fire was also ceremonial. Fire always is, in these contexts. Fire is one of the oldest human technologies, older than any culture, older than any tradition, older than language as we understand it. Fire in an enclosed underground space has a specific quality that fire on the surface does not have. It is contained. It is intimate. The boundaries of the world shrink to the boundary of the firelight and the boundary of the stone walls. Outside that boundary is darkness that is total, the absolute absence of light that you only find underground, the darkness that is also silence and also stillness and also a kind of pressure that comes from being entirely surrounded by the earth. In that space, with that fire, whatever ceremony was performed would have had a quality of intensity that the open-air ceremonies on the Medicine Wheel hilltops could not replicate. Not better or worse, complementary. The sky ceremonies for the people gathered under the open sky in full light. The earth ceremonies for the smaller group who went down into the dark and met whatever waited there. The ochre handprint in the passage was not made casually. You do not carry red ochre powder underground and press your hand against a cave wall as an afterthought. It was a deliberate act performed in a specific place for a specific reason. The tradition of handprints in enclosed or sacred spaces goes back 30,000 years or more in human history. It crosses every continent. It appears in cultures that had no contact with each other. The hand pressed against stone in darkness, the negative image left behind by pigment blown around it. This is one of the oldest, most universal, most deeply human acts in the archaeological record. I was here. This is my hand. I touched this stone. Remember that I was alive. Whoever left that handprint in the Saskatchewan passage was not a primitive person. They were a person, fully human, fully conscious, fully present in their own moment of history. They were doing something that their tradition called them to do in that specific space, and they were doing it in a line of human behavior that stretches back to the firelit caves of Europe and the handprint caves of Indonesia and the painted rock shelters of southern Africa. A line of behavior that has not ended, that continues in every act of deliberate human marking on a surface, from that first handprint in red to the signatures we put on documents, to the names we carve in trees, to the messages we leave for people who will come after us. The Saskatchewan passage was one point on that line, a point that connects the ancient practices of the northern plains to the deepest traditions of human ceremonial life, a point that, when the family broke through that fieldstone wall, became visible again after 800 years of darkness. The tablet and its silence. The incised stone tablet found in the second chamber of the passage remains, at the time of this telling, undeciphered, and that fact deserves more attention than it typically receives. The marks on the tablet are organized. They are not random. They show evidence of planning, of deliberate arrangement of lines and dots in a pattern that repeats and varies in ways that suggest a system rather than improvisation. The technique used to create them, a sharp stone tool drawn across the softer limestone surface with controlled pressure, was skilled. The marks are clean, consistent in depth and character, the product of someone who had done this before or who had been carefully taught. It is not a writing system in the sense that we use the term. It does not appear to encode language in the way that cuneiform encodes Sumerian or hieroglyphs encode Egyptian or the Roman alphabet encodes English. But the absence of phonetic writing does not mean the absence of meaning. Symbolic notation systems of various kinds appear throughout the pre-Columbian archaeological record of North America and everywhere else on Earth. Some of these systems encoded numerical information, counts, calendars, records of tribute or trade. Some encoded spatial information, maps, route markers, territory boundaries. Some appear to have encoded ceremonial or cosmological information, records of astronomical observations, markers of sacred sites and their relationships, instruments for maintaining ritual knowledge across generations in a culture without phonetic writing. The distribution of marks on the Saskatchewan tablet, the way the lines radiate from certain clusters of dots, the way the patterns in different sections of the tablet appear to relate to each other, has led some researchers to compare it provisionally to the counting and calendar devices found at other North American sites. The old copper culture, whose artifacts appear in the passage in the form of worked copper, used bones and stones with incised marks in ways that appear to track astronomical cycles, particularly lunar cycles, across periods of months and years. If the Saskatchewan tablet is a calendrical device or a record of astronomical observations, it connects to a tradition of sky watching that we can trace across thousands of years of North American prehistory, the alignment of medicine wheels with stellar and solar events, the astronomical orientations of Mississippian mound complexes, including Cahokia itself, where a set of large timber posts known as woodhenge was used to track the equinoxes and other astronomical events. The sophisticated calendar systems of the Maya and other Mesoamerican peoples, whose astronomical precision rivaled anything produced by contemporary Old World civilizations. On the northern plains, far from the monumental architecture and written records of Mesoamerica, the tracking of the sky was no less important. The seasonal movements of bison herds, the timing of plant harvests, the ceremonial calendar that governed when gatherings happened and when certain rituals were performed. All of these required a knowledge of time, of the year's cycles, of the sky's regular patterns, and their relationship to conditions on the ground. A small stone tablet with carefully arranged marks, kept in a dark underground chamber where it would be preserved from weathering, could have been a tool for maintaining that knowledge. A physical record of observations made over years or decades, consulted and updated by the people who tended the passage and its ceremonies. We don't know. We may never know with certainty. The specific tradition that produced the tablet, whatever language its creators spoke, whatever cultural framework they inhabited, is not accessible to us through written records or through oral traditions that have been preserved continuously to the present. We have the object, we have its context, we have the tools of analysis and comparison, and we have the humility to admit that those tools may not be sufficient to recover the full meaning of what was left in that chamber 8 centuries ago. But the silence of the tablet is itself informative. It tells us that we are looking at something genuinely outside the established record, not a forgery, not a misidentification, not a previously documented artifact type that we simply haven't recognized. Something new, something that challenges us to expand the framework of what we know and think we know about the depth and richness of pre-Columbian intellectual and ceremonial life on the northern plains. The tablet's silence is an invitation. It is asking someone, some future researcher with better tools and better context, to come back and try again. The copper thread. The 2 pieces of copper found in the second chamber of the Saskatchewan passage are, in some ways, the most straightforwardly significant artifacts recovered from the site, not because they are larger or more elaborate than the tablet, but because their presence draws a direct line between the Saskatchewan passage and a network of culture and trade that spans the entirety of pre-Columbian North American history. Native copper, the pure metallic copper that occurs naturally without needing smelting, is found in significant deposits in the Lake Superior region, particularly on the Keweenaw Peninsula of what is now Michigan and on Isle Royale. This copper has been mined and worked by indigenous peoples for at least 7,000 years. The scale of ancient copper mining in the Lake Superior region is extraordinary and almost entirely unappreciated by the general public. There are ancient mine pits throughout the Keweenaw Peninsula, thousands of them, some going down several meters, showing evidence of systematic, organized extraction, using stone hammers, wooden tools, and fire. The total amount of copper removed from these deposits by pre-Columbian miners has been estimated at over 1 billion pounds. 1 billion pounds of copper removed from the earth by hand over several thousand years. Where did it all go? This is one of the genuine mysteries of North American archaeology. The amount of copper recovered in archaeological sites, however widely distributed, does not account for the amount that was clearly extracted. Some was consumed, some was lost, some is waiting to be found in sites not yet excavated. But the question of where 1 billion pounds of copper went is a question that points toward levels of production, exchange, and consumption that we don't have a fully satisfying model for. What we know is that the old copper culture, the tradition of cold-hammered copper, working centered in the Great Lakes region, produced objects that traveled enormous distances. Old copper artifacts have been found from the Gulf Coast to the Canadian boreal forest, from the eastern seaboard to the Great Plains. They appear in burial sites across much of eastern North America over a period of several thousand years. The Mississippian culture, which flourished during the centuries immediately preceding the construction of the Saskatchewan Passage, continued and elaborated the tradition of copper working and long-distance copper exchange. Mississippian copper artifacts, including large ornamental copper plates with complex imagery of ceremonial figures, birds, and cosmic symbols, appear at sites across the eastern half of the continent. Copper was a prestige material, a sacred material, a material whose redness and brightness connected it symbolically to fire, to the sun, to the powers that govern life and death and the turning of the seasons. The worked copper in the Saskatchewan Passage was not produced locally. There is no significant native copper in Saskatchewan's geological profile. It came from somewhere else. It traveled along the trade networks that move materials across the continent, through multiple hands and over considerable distances, from the Lake Superior copper country to the Saskatchewan plains, and it was brought into the passage, into the underground ceremonial space, where it was placed in the second chamber, with the other objects of significance. Kept there, left there, presumably for a reason. The act of bringing copper into the passage, of carrying it across hundreds or thousands of kilometers of landscape through the relay of trade relationships that sustain the Mississippian exchange network, was not a casual act. Copper did not arrive in people's hands accidentally. It was sought, traded for, valued, transported with care. The people who brought it to Saskatchewan knew what they had. They knew, or their tradition told them, where it came from, what land it had been pulled from, what powers or properties it carried by virtue of its origin and its nature. And they brought it to the passage because the passage was a place that warranted objects of that significance. The presence of copper in the passage is not just evidence of trade connections. It is evidence of value, of sacredness. Copper objects were not everyday items. They were not casual trade goods like corn or dried meat or basic stone tools. They were made and traded and used and deposited in ceremonial contexts. The people who brought copper into the Saskatchewan Passage were bringing something that represented the highest levels of exchange and the deepest levels of ceremonial meaning available to them. They were bringing something precious into a space that was, to them, sacred. That tells us something about the status of the passage in the ceremonial economy of its time. It was not a minor local feature. It was a site significant enough to receive objects of the highest ceremonial value from the long-distance trade network. It was, in whatever local or regional tradition it belonged to, a place of considerable importance, a place where the trade of the visible world met the ceremony of the underground world, a place where the far distances that copper had traveled were compressed into the small dark chamber where it finally came to rest. The question of abandonment. At some point, the passage was abandoned. The fires in its chambers went out. The people who had tended it and used it stopped coming. The objects in the second chamber were left in place. The passage fell dark and silent and stayed that way for centuries. Why? This is the question that has no clean answer, and it is one of the most poignant questions that the Saskatchewan passage raises. These were people who clearly cared about this space. They had built it with skill and intention. They had maintained it over what appears to have been an extended period of use. They had brought precious objects into it. They had left handprints on its walls. And then they had stopped, and the silence had taken over. The abandonment of archaeological sites, ceremonial or otherwise, is never a trivial event. People do not walk away from places that matter to them without a reason. Sometimes the reason is catastrophic. Epidemic disease, violent conflict, climate disaster, the kind of sudden crisis that breaks a community's connection to its landscape and its traditions. Sometimes it is gradual, slow climate deterioration, making a region less viable, trade networks shifting away from a region, population movement driven by pressures that accumulate over decades. Sometimes it is deliberate, a decision to close a ceremonial site, to seal it, to allow it to return to the earth in acknowledgement that its active period has ended. The period around 1200 to 1350 CE was a time of significant disruption across much of North America. The medieval warm period was ending. A prolonged drought struck the southwestern United States, causing the abandonment of major ancestral Puebloan sites, including Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. Cahokia began its long decline around 1200 CE, its population dispersing for reasons that are still debated but appear to include environmental degradation, resource depletion, and political instability. On the northern plains, evidence of widespread disruption of established settlement patterns appears in the archaeological record around this same period. This disruption was not simple or uniform. It was a cascade. When the trade networks that connected communities across the continent were stressed by climate and conflict and population movement, the effects rippled outward in ways that were not predictable. A community in Saskatchewan whose ceremonial practice depended on copper from Lake Superior, on ceremonial knowledge that moved along the same routes as the copper, on the maintenance of relationships with trading partners. Hundreds of kilometers away, such a community would have felt the effects of disruption at the center of those networks, even if the disruption itself happened far from where they lived. The threads that held the continental fabric together were long, and the fabric, when it began to tear, tore in unexpected places. Communities that had been stable for generations found themselves isolated. Traditions that had been maintained through the active exchange of people and objects and ideas found themselves without the connections that had sustained them. The ceremonial life of the northern plains in the 13th and 14th centuries was being reorganized by forces that operated at a scale larger than any community could fully see or understand. The timing of the abandonment of the Saskatchewan Passage, if it occurred around the later end of its apparent use period, around 1200 CE, would place it in precisely this period of continental disruption. The networks that had sustained the passage, the trade connections that brought copper from the Great Lakes, the ceremonial traditions that gave it meaning and sent people underground with fire and ochre. Those networks were being stressed and broken and rerouted by changes at a continental scale. Communities that had been stable for generations were moving. Traditions that had been maintained for centuries were being disrupted. When the people who tended the passage left, they did not destroy it, they did not fill it in or collapse it. They left the objects in the chamber, They left the handprints on the walls. They left the passage open and breathing, still connected to the natural geological feature that had given it that quality of living air. They left it, but they left it whole. Left it as if they intended to return, or as if they understood that someone else, some future person, or people who would understand its significance, might come back to it eventually. 800 years later, someone did. The land remembers. There is a phrase that appears in various forms across many indigenous philosophical traditions of North America. The land remembers. Not as metaphor, not as poetic language for something that doesn't literally mean what it says, but as a description of something understood to be real, the capacity of the physical landscape to hold, in some form, the record of what has happened in it and to it over time. Science, approached from a different direction, arrives at something that is not entirely distant from this idea. The land does remember in the literal physical sense. Sediment cores drilled from lake beds carry records of ancient climates, pollen from plant communities that no longer exist, charcoal from fires that burned centuries or millennia ago. Bedrock carries the marks of glaciers and the chemistry of ancient oceans. Soil profiles record centuries of land use, of burning and planning and walking and building. The bones and teeth and seeds and pollen preserved in archaeological sites carry the chemistry of the food webs that sustained ancient communities, the isotopic signatures of ancient diets and ancient climates. The Saskatchewan Passage is a form of the land's memory. It is a space in the earth that retained, against the odds, the record of what happened inside it. The charcoal from ancient fires, the ochre from ancient hands, the copper from ancient trade networks, the incised marks on an ancient tablet. All of these are forms of memory preserved in the earth, waiting for someone to come and read them. The fieldstone wall that the homesteaders built was also a form of memory, though a different kind. It was the memory of an encounter with something that couldn't be explained, something that had to be sealed away. The memory of a moment in colonial history when the depth of what was already here on this land was too large to be absorbed, too uncomfortable to be confronted, and so was walled off and left in the dark. When the family pulled down that wall in 2019, they were not just opening a physical space, they were opening a temporal one. They were creating a connection between a family doing home renovations in 21st century Saskatchewan and a group of people performing ceremony in a stone-lined passage 1,000 years ago, connected by the unbroken thread of the earth itself, by the persistence of stone and ochre and copper and incised marks in the dark. That connection is what archaeology is at its best. Not the theft of objects or the appropriation of other people's stories, but the careful, respectful, attentive work of listening to what the earth has to say, of hearing the land remember, of taking seriously the evidence that what was happening here before the history books start was complex and sophisticated and worthy of the same careful attention we give to the civilizations that left written records of their own significance. The Saskatchewan Passage has not told us everything it knows. It has been open for only a few years. The investigation is ongoing. The tablet has not yielded its meaning. The full extent of the natural geological feature that the passage connects to has not been mapped. There may be more to find. There almost certainly is. Other doors. The Saskatchewan Passage has a way of reframing what you think you know about other things. Once you know it exists, once you accept what it implies about the depth and complexity of pre-Columbian life on the northern plains, you start looking at other pieces of the puzzle differently. There are other passages. There are other underground features in the archaeological record of the northern plains that have received inadequate attention. Some are in areas where the surface has not been systematically surveyed. Some are known to local communities, indigenous and settler, but have not been formally investigated. Some are in the archives of early land surveyors and government reports, described in language that their authors didn't have the context to interpret correctly, filed away, and not followed up. There is a report from a Dominion land survey conducted in the 1880s, in the years when the Saskatchewan plains were being divided into townships and sections for agricultural settlement, in which the surveyor describes an encounter with what he calls an ancient stone-lined pit on the edge of a creek valley in what is now central Saskatchewan. He describes it as probably a cache or well dug by previous residents, notes that it appears to go deeper than is necessary for either of those purposes, and moves on. That report is in the Library and Archives Canada. Nobody has gone to look at the site it describes with the tools and questions that the Saskatchewan passage now makes relevant. There are similar accounts in the journals of early fur traders and missionaries, people who moved through the Saskatchewan country in the 18th and 19th centuries, and who occasionally noted, without understanding, features of the landscape that indigenous peoples treated with obvious significance. A particular rock formation, a specific valley where no one would camp, a hillside that was marked in ways the traders couldn't read, a place where the ground had an unusual quality that older members of the community would not discuss with outsiders. Some of these observations are frustratingly vague. The explorers and surveyors who made them were working in a framework that had no category for what they were seeing. Their journals were written for practical purposes, for the advancement of colonial enterprise, for the mapping and categorizing of territory in preparation for settlement. A strange stone-lined pit was an obstacle to be noted and avoided, not a mystery to be investigated. The possibility that it was a piece of an ancient ceremonial landscape connecting the Plains peoples to a continent-wide tradition of underground ceremony simply did not exist as a thought that could occur to them. But those observations are there, in the archives, in the yellowing pages of handwritten journals preserved in libraries and government record offices across the country, waiting for someone to read them with the questions that the Saskatchewan passage has now put in our hands. All of these are potential threads. All of them lead back toward a history of this land that is not in the official record, a history of underground ceremonies and sky watching and continental trade networks, and a relationship with the earth that is older and richer than anything that has been acknowledged in the founding documents of the country that now occupies this territory. The Saskatchewan Passage is one door into that history, but it is not the only door, and every door that opens onto it has the same quality. It opens onto darkness, and the darkness breathes, and the air coming through has the mineral smell of deep time. And somewhere in that darkness, if you bring a light and go carefully and listen, there is something waiting to be understood. The stars above them. One of the things that is easy to forget about the people who built the Saskatchewan Passage is that they lived under the same stars we do. Not the same stars exactly, because the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, called precession, shifts the position of the celestial pole over thousands of years, so the North Star they oriented by was not Polaris but a different star, Thuban, or depending on the precise date of construction, some point between them. But the constellations, the familiar patterns of the winter sky over the plains, Orion rising in the southeast, the Pleiades hanging in the west, the bright slash of the winter, Milky Way overhead, those have not changed significantly in 8 centuries. The sky, the builders of the Saskatchewan Passage saw when they came up from their underground work and looked up from the prairie, was essentially the sky that a person standing in the same spot today would see. They knew that sky intimately. They had to. The timing of seasonal ceremonies, the navigation across the plains over long distances, the prediction of weather and seasonal change, all of this required a knowledge of the sky that we, living under light-polluted horizons, have almost entirely lost. A person on the Saskatchewan plains in 1100 CE in a clear night in winter would have seen a sky so full of stars that it would appear almost crowded, the individual stars supplemented by the great sweep of the Milky Way dense enough to cast a faint shadow. That sky was their calendar, their compass, their library, their spiritual text. They read it the way we read books, with the accumulated knowledge of generations, seeing in its patterns and movements information that was both practical and profound. The connection between the underground passage and the sky above may not be coincidental. At other ceremonially significant sites in the Northern Plains tradition, there are correspondences between underground features and celestial alignments. At some medicine wheel sites, the spokes that point toward underground or subsurface features, natural springs, cave openings, places where water emerges from the ground, align with astronomical events. The relationship between above and below is mapped onto the relationship between earth and sky. The passage into the earth is connected to the movement of the sky above. We do not have evidence that the Saskatchewan passage has specific astronomical alignments because the farmhouse built above it has made that kind of assessment impossible with current investigation methods. But the awareness that this connection was important to the people who built it is worth carrying forward. They were people who read the sky. They were people who built underground. The relationship between those two facts is part of the story we are still learning to read. The bison and the bone. There is one more element of the Saskatchewan passage that deserves extended attention. The animal bones found in the second chamber, the ones that showed evidence of human processing. These were not food waste. The cut marks on them were deliberate and careful, not the kind of processing you do when you are butchering an animal for food. They were more precise, more considered, more focused on specific parts of specific bones. Bone working of this kind, the careful processing of specific animal bones for specific purposes, is a practice with deep roots in the ceremonial traditions of the Plains peoples. Bones, particularly the skulls and certain long bones of significant animals, held specific ceremonial value. The relationship between hunters and the animals they hunted was not simply predatory. It was understood as a relationship between peoples, between the human community and the bison community, or the elk community, or the deer community. The hunters were not taking without obligation. They were participating in an exchange that required acknowledgement, gratitude, and specific ritual practices to maintain. Some of those practices involved the careful treatment of bones after the meat had been removed. The skull returned to the landscape in a specific way, the bones of the legs arranged in a particular pattern, certain bones kept and modified for ritual use. These practices ensured that the spiritual dimension of the hunt was honored, that the relationship between hunter and hunted was maintained in a way that would continue to be productive. You treated the bones of the animals you killed with respect because the animals who would agree to be killed in the future were watching, or so the understanding went, and they would respond to how you treated their relations. The bones in the Saskatchewan passage were probably not from the animals hunted for food in the immediate vicinity. They were likely brought in specifically for ceremonial purposes. The processing they received, the careful shaping into implements or ornaments, speaks to a tradition of bone, working that connected the physical remains of animals to the ceremonial practices that govern the relationship between the human community and the animal community. They are, in a very literal sense, evidence of a worldview in which animals were not resources to be extracted, but relatives to be maintained in relationship, and in which that maintenance required specific acts, performed in specific places, using specific objects. The underground passage was one of those specific places, a place where the work of maintaining relationship with the animal world and with the powers that govern that relationship could be done properly, in the dark, in the earth, away from the ordinary world above. What we owe the passage. There is an ethical dimension to the discovery of the Saskatchewan passage that is worth naming directly. This is not just a scientific mystery or an archaeological puzzle. It is the material remains of the ceremonial life of people who had no way to consent to its discovery. People who, if they could have anticipated that their sacred space would one day be found beneath a farmhouse basement by a family doing home renovations, might have had very specific feelings about what should happen next. Canadian law, specifically the First Nations Sacred Ceremonial Objects, Repatriation Act in Alberta, and similar legislation in other provinces and at the federal level, addresses the question of Indigenous ceremonial objects and sites with varying degrees of comprehensiveness. The consultation requirements and the rights of Indigenous communities in relation to discoveries on traditional territories are legally recognized, though the application of those laws is inconsistent and often contested. The family who found the passage contacted the provincial government, who contacted archaeologists, who contacted representatives of several First Nations communities whose traditional territories include the area. Those consultations are ongoing. The objects recovered from the passage, including the tablet and the copper and the processed bone, are currently in a holding facility while the question of their ultimate disposition is worked out. The passage itself has been protected, the opening preserved and documented, the site accorded the same kind of protection given to any registered archaeological site in the province. The Indigenous communities consulted have taken a range of positions on the discovery, from cautious engagement with the archaeological investigation to more protective stances that prioritize the sanctity of the site over scientific inquiry. None of these positions is unreasonable. They reflect the diversity of views within any community and the complexity of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the institutions, including scientific institutions that have historically treated Indigenous history and material culture as resources to be extracted rather than as the property and patrimony of living people. What seems clear is that the Saskatchewan Passage is not just a scientific resource, it is a cultural heritage site. It belongs to the traditions, even if those traditions are not fully recoverable, of the people who built it. The work of understanding it should proceed in partnership with those people's descendants, not over their objections. And the story of that partnership, the negotiation between scientific curiosity and Indigenous sovereignty, between the desire to know and the right to protect, is itself a story that is being written right now, in the same way that the original story of the passage was written, one careful act at a time. What lies beneath the prairies. The Saskatchewan Passage is one site. One passage, 47 meters long, with 2 wider chambers, a carved stone tablet, some worked copper, some processed bone, and a handprint in red ochre that stopped an archaeologist in her tracks when she first saw it. But the Saskatchewan plains are enormous. The limestone karst that underlies much of the province and neighboring Alberta is enormous. The history of human occupation of that landscape, stretching back 15,000 years or more, is enormous, and the portion of that occupation that has been systematically investigated, documented, and understood is small. Very small. There are medicine wheels in Saskatchewan that have not been studied. There are archaeological sites detected by aerial survey or satellite imagery that have not been excavated. There are river valleys and creek beds and escarpments and lake shores and hilltops that have yielded surface finds but never been properly investigated. There are places that Indigenous communities hold as significant, as connected to their traditions and their histories, that have never been formally documented. Beneath the surface, the situation is more opaque still. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of limited areas have revealed subsurface features whose nature is unknown. Aerial thermal imaging has shown anomalies in the ground that suggest below-surface structures or voids in places where the surface shows no evidence of any human activity. LiDAR surveys, which use laser scanning to strip away vegetation and reveal subtle topographic features, have shown earthwork features across the Saskatchewan plains that have not been investigated on the ground. In other words, we are seeing from above and from various remote sensing perspectives hints of a landscape that is much more archaeologically rich than the surface presents to the eye. We are seeing evidence that the Saskatchewan plains, far from being an empty wilderness before European settlement, were a landscape intensively used, modified, and marked by human communities over thousands of years. A landscape whose below-ground record has barely been touched. The Saskatchewan Passage may be the most spectacular single find from this landscape so far, but it is almost certainly not unique, and it is almost certainly one of multiple underground or semi-underground features in a geography that is full of limestone karst, full of natural subsurface voids and fractures, full of places where a people who understood the relationship between the sky above and the earth below might have decided to mark their passage through the world by going down into the dark. The thought that there may be more of these spaces under the Saskatchewan prairies, more passages and chambers and ceremonial spaces waiting in the dark beneath the surface of a land that appears to be flat and featureless and empty, is one of the most exciting and unsettling thoughts that the discovery raises, because it means we don't actually know what is underneath the ground we walk on. We know some of it. We have sampled a fraction of it. But the full story of the pre-Columbian Saskatchewan plains is not in our hands yet. It is still, in very large part, in the earth. The weight of time. 800 years is a long time in one way of counting. It is 20 or more generations of human lives. It is the span of time between the present and the high medieval period in Europe, between us and the Magna Carta, between us and Genghis Khan, between us and the time when the first Gothic cathedrals were being raised toward the sky in France, while half a world away and completely unknown to each other, someone was descending into a stone passage beneath the Saskatchewan plains with a torch and a piece of red ochre and objects of copper and bone and a small carved tablet whose meaning we have not recovered. But 800 years is a short time in another way of counting. It is nothing to the bedrock the passage was built into. It is a thin film on the surface of the geological time that shaped this landscape. It is a breath, a pause, a momentary interval in the 4 billion year story of the Canadian Shield. And somewhere between those two scales, the human scale and the geological scale, is where the Saskatchewan Passage exists, in deep time and in human time simultaneously, old enough to predate the country that now contains it, young enough to have been built by people whose descendants are alive today, whose traditions, however fragmented and disrupted, have not entirely disappeared from the world. The passage exists in that interval, and so do we, the people who are now aware of it, the people who will decide what to do with the knowledge of it, the people who will determine whether this discovery leads to a deeper understanding of this land's history, or whether it becomes another chapter in a long story of indigenous heritage being discovered, analyzed, and then moved past without being truly heard. The weight of that choice is real. It rests on everyone who knows about this passage and has to decide what to make of it. On the archaeologists who can choose to treat it as raw data or as someone's sacred inheritance. On the government agencies that can choose to protect it or to prioritize the development of the land above it. On the indigenous communities who can choose to engage with the investigation or to call for closure and protection. on the family who found it, who made the choice to call for help rather than to wall it back up and pretend it wasn't there, and who by doing so set in motion over everything that followed, and on the people who hear this story and have to decide whether it changes how they understand the land they live on, the history they were taught, and the people who were here before them, because that is what a discovery like this ultimately asks of us. Not just intellectual curiosity, though it deserves that. Not just scientific attention, though it deserves that too. It asks for a kind of moral reckoning. The reckoning that comes from understanding that the history of this land is longer and richer and more complex than the version you were given, and that the people who live that history are not safely in the past, but are connected through kinship and tradition and the long thread of survival to people who are alive today and who have a stake in how that history is understood and who gets to tell it. The children who would have known. There is something that tends to get lost when we talk about ancient sites and ancient peoples in the abstract language of archaeology and trade networks and cultural traditions. Something that the objects in the passage keep pulling us back toward. The tablet is not just evidence of a symbolic system. The copper is not just evidence of a trade network. The handprint on the wall is not just evidence of a ceremonial practice. All of these things were made and placed and pressed by specific people. People who woke up in the morning and ate breakfast and had arguments and told jokes and worried about their children and felt the cold of a Saskatchewan winter in their bones. Someone built the passage, several people, probably, over several seasons of work. They quarried stone and carried it underground and fitted it into walls by torchlight. Their hands were roughened from it. Their backs ached from bending in the low sections. When the work was done, there was probably a moment of satisfaction, of looking at what had been made and feeling that it was right, that it was good, that it served the purpose it was built for. And then someone younger came down into it for the first time. A teenager maybe, being brought for the first time into this space by an older relative who knew its purpose. There is a moment that every human tradition of initiation has in common, whether it is an elder leading a young person into a ceremonial chamber in a Saskatchewan limestone passage in 1100 CE, or a rabbi leading a young person through the doors of a synagogue for the first time, or a grandfather taking a child fishing on a river that 5 generations of his family have fished. The moment of threshold crossing, the moment of being brought into something that was there before you and will be there after you. The moment of understanding that you are part of a lineage, a tradition, a practice that extends backward and forward beyond your own individual life. That moment happened in the Saskatchewan Passage, probably many times. The passage was not a sealed vault. It was a used space, a space that was visited and maintained and added to over what appears to have been an extended period of time. The ochre on the walls was not applied in a single session. The objects in the chamber accumulated. The fires in the hearths were lit more than once. This was a living space, a ceremonial space that was woven into the life of a community over generations. Children would have known about it, not necessarily been brought into it, not in early childhood, but they would have known it existed. They would have grown up in the knowledge that somewhere beneath the ground there was a place where certain things happened, where the elders went sometimes, where ceremony took place that was connected to the powers that governed the world of the living and the dead and the sky and the animals. That knowledge would have been part of how they understood the landscape they lived in, part of how they understood their own community's relationship with this specific piece of ground. When the passage was abandoned, those children, grown now, would have carried the knowledge of it with them into whatever displacement or migration or transformation followed the disruption of the 13th and 14th centuries. they would have told their own children. In the way that people tell children about the important places, the places that matter even when you can no longer go to them. Maybe the story became simpler with each generation, the specific ceremonial details fading as the tradition that sustained them was stressed and altered by the disruption of the times. Maybe it became a story about a place underground where the ancestors had done important things. Maybe eventually it became something more like a legend, a reference to a time before the time, to a way of being in the world that had been possible once and was now part of the deep past. And then even that faded. The continuity of telling was broken, as it was broken for so many things by the centuries of colonial disruption that followed European contact. The residential schools that took children from their families and punished them for speaking their languages and keeping their traditions did not only affect the generations that went through them. They broke the chain of transmission that carries specific, local, site-specific knowledge from one generation to the next. The knowledge of the passage, if any trace of it had survived into the era of contact, would have been exactly the kind of knowledge most vulnerable to that breaking. But the passage itself survived. Stone does not forget. Ochre does not forget. The cool mineral breath of the earth moving through a 47-meter passage in the limestone of the Saskatchewan plains does not forget. The objects placed in the second chamber by human hands 1,000 years ago sat there in the dark and waited, as patient as rock, as indifferent to the passage of human time as the bedrock they rested on. Until the day a family in Saskatchewan decided to renovate their basement, and the wall that a homesteader had built over a mystery came down, and the passage breathed its ancient breath into a basement in the 21st century, and the world split again into before and after. A final descent. Let's go down one more time. Let's walk the passage from the beginning. You step through the opening where the fieldstone wall used to be. The air changes immediately. You feel it on your face, that cool mineral breath coming toward you from somewhere ahead. Your light catches the stonework of the walls, the careful fitting of fieldstone and limestone, the mortar between them dark with age. The ceiling is low here. You move carefully, watching your footing on the uneven floor. The passage slopes gently downward. After 10 meters, the sounds of the basement behind you have faded entirely. After 20 meters, there is no light from behind you. Your light is all there is. The circle of it catches the walls, the ceiling, the floor ahead. Beyond the circle, the dark is complete. 30 meters in, you reach the first wider section. The ceiling rises. The walls on either side have a different quality here, more finished, more deliberate. You can feel the difference in the air. It's warmer here than in the passage proper, marginally, as if the wider space holds heat from something that happened here long ago. You look at the floor. You can see the remnant of the hearth, the shallow depression in the rock, the slight darkening of the stone around it from ancient fire. You go on. The passage narrows again. Your light catches something on the left wall. A smear of reddish color, low down near the floor, faded almost to invisibility, but present. Ochre. You don't touch it. 40 meters. The passage opens again, the second wider chamber. Your light reaches the walls, and there it is, at about shoulder height on the far wall. A handprint in red. Negative image, the stone visible through the pigment, except where the pigment is deepest at the edges of the hand, the ghost of a palm and 5 fingers pressed flat against the limestone 800 years ago. You stop. You stand there for a moment, and you look at it. You are separated from the person who made that mark by 8 centuries, by the entire span of European presence in North America, by the collapse of Cahokia and the founding of Canada and the residential school system and 2 world wars and everything else that has happened on the surface of this land since the last fire went out in this chamber. You are separated by a language you don't know and a tradition you can only partially reconstruct, and a worldview you can only partially imagine. But the hand is the same size as yours. The proportions are the same. The spread of the fingers against the stone, that gesture of open contact, that basic human act of touching a surface and leaving a mark that says I was here, that is the same gesture that you would make. That is the same impulse that has driven humans to mark their presence on surfaces from the cave walls of Ice Age Europe to the concrete of a freshly poured sidewalk to the surface of the moon. You're looking at a specific person who stood in this specific spot, in this specific chamber, on this specific piece of the earth, who carried red ochre and a torch and objects of copper and bone, who performed whatever ceremony this space was built for, and who, before leaving, or maybe on the very first visit, pressed a hand against the wall and left this. You carry that image back up the passage with you, through the narrowing and the widening and the return of the basement. Light and the smell of a house that has existed for 100 years on top of something that was already centuries old when the house was built. You carry it back up into the world. The passage breathes behind you. It will still be there when you're gone. It has been waiting a long time, and it is patient, and it has things still to say to anyone willing to go down into the dark and listen. And somewhere on the other side of that patience, in a chamber where a small fire once burned and hands once pressed red pigment against limestone and copper, once rested against ancient rock, the question that the passage was built to hold is still alive. What is the relationship between the human world above and the earth below? What is owed to the powers that move in the dark spaces? What does it mean to go down into the ground and come back out, changed, carrying something that wasn't there before? Those questions were old when the passage was built. They will be old when the passage is fully understood, if that day ever comes. They are among the oldest questions human beings have ever asked. The Saskatchewan passage is one answer to them, offered in stone and ochre and copper and fire and the slow, cool breath of moving air, by people who knew this ground well enough to go into it, 800 years ago, under a sky of stars that still turns above the same plains tonight. The farmhouse still stands. The basement still has its bare bulb and its uneven floor. The opening where the fieldstone wall used to be is still there, still breathing, still connected to whatever waits in the dark at the far end of 47 meters of ancient stone. The family that found it has not walled it back up. They left it open. That choice, small and quiet and entirely human, is its own kind of answer to the oldest questions. Some things deserve to breathe, and maybe that is the last thing to sit with tonight. Not the mystery of the tablet, not the trade routes, or the dating, or the ochre on the wall. Just the fact that a family on the Saskatchewan plains pulled down a stone wall and chose not to put it back, chose to let the air move, chose to let the question live. The earth beneath them had been keeping that question for 800 years. It can afford to keep it a little longer, patient as limestone, quiet as deep time, waiting for whoever comes next with a light and the willingness to go in. ND.